Wildly wide markets falling out over Lehman Bob fallouts, head-crashing downward desperations. Mega headlining, market whizmos, investical whatsits, stocko dropping, drowning under Lehman Bob aftershocks.
Impactico hitting all sectors, especially whacker wobbling, already uber wobbling banking sector. And maybe all downward together, adjoining economica bottery, ramo randangling, fighting face saving between Ostro Kino, including Chicago's.
Endangering worldwide into economica abyss. Needing a hole in the head right now for Pulipunka enlisting von Hayek. Uber utter, head-crashing irresponsibility, whilst right now publica politica statesmanship, statescraft is called for.
Enraging econs, you, Chicago's, Kinos, far more randangling each other than addressing the economy.
Yes, indeedy, as Kino or Chicagoza or desist from silly-willy slamody riding me, snappy snapping, ever rubbishing, misinterpreting Austro theory, that a far better recounts Huron than any other economica screwdriver.
Sankers to Bernanke, Wizzo worked well enough, albeit slightly bungo-boobed up right now. Yes, of course, I just wanted to respond to recent criticisms about Chicagoza. With Friedrich atop right now, within the New York Fed. He's making economists look ridiculous.
Kino versus Hayek versus Milto. Only one financial crisis, but more than one economist wanting to solve it.
Well, in truth, perhaps not. For alas, in now, having to finally fess up, having to shatter your wide-eyed expectations into smithereens, for Zaggle Zooogle Zankeedoodle Part 1 abridged, the so-called Wizzo Bang, mega motion picture econo sci-fi spectacular, will not be coming to any cinema, or anytime soon, or more likely as not, will never grace the silver screen, for what you just saw was a rough, mock-up pictured movie trailer of a film, chancing to be made real, but beyond mere gimmickry, movie concept or screenplay pitch, awaiting to be writ up, when at least having now been fully written, and lavishly illustrated with preliminary, pre-production pictures, an unfilmed script, ambitioning the first part of a filmable franchise, now being published, that if wins enough readership, however unlikely, may indicate movie can be made. Borrowing, and fitfully attempting, and taking, the very same well-trodden path as books do, except this time round, needing no adaptation into screenplay, after already at least written, near enough, revving ready to go get filmed, being, of course, the only reason why screenplays are ever written, and the vainglorious hapless hope of achieving their big picture telos, for unlike books, can be an end in itself, whereas screenplays it only be after turned into film, validating their purpose, else why write them, except this time, not top-down decided if ought filmed, through submitting to the usual studio production rubric. whilst now at least endeavoring, through a mass publishing means, bottom-up determining, if Zaggle Zooogle series could ever be filmed and authored, as deep-felt idiosyncratic intended, how he wants to see it, but now needs wider audience, indeed readership, to agree, a mass market finding out that just maybe, it could be made film. And no doubt economists would aptly agree, being the only way, if they were to be made film. Thus, worthy now trying, allying herein, hopefully helpfully explaining, dare exploring, Zaggle Zooogle Zankeedoodle Part 1 abridged, from concept to completed script, among much else. And if never filmed, at least now published, chancing wider read, unlike most other unmade screenplays, remaining dusty, shelved, forlorn, forgotten, and unread, despite equaling time and effort put into them, alike poured into writing books. And moreover, any film exploring economics, even made more palatable in sci-fi, would not garner studio funding interest to be made as writ or allow author direct, thus now chancing to circumvent the script to film top-down route, via publishing to maybe accrue bottom-up interest, empowering him enough to get Zaggle Zooogle started blasting off the ground, or at least somehow wider read, Cinematica exploring, dare popularizing economics through sci-fi means world afar, but still, much alike ours, that everyday taxpayers endured, and still resenting, indebted today, when having to foot Guvo, to bail out bungling bankery in '08 financial crisis, found culpable amid others, for way back, over 10 years ago, yet super surely, mega taxpaying most of us, can no doubt still vividly recall, the hoopla, hysterics, and hurly-wordy hullabaloo, Ramo rawing, enraging, over whether everybody everywhere would still have a bank, or bank account, or any money left in there, risking ruining everyone, revisiting Great Depression. And yet, what recessioned us near lasting 10 years was bad enough, let alone for economics being shown how vital, for now perhaps wider engage everyday readership, relevant, receptive, and ready, for this aspiring saga, engrossing enough, for maybe made film, enthralling. '08 financial crisis, CDO, CDS, for super sanctioning, headlong profiting, up unto found hubris, amongst other econo theory, so-called clever cloggery, except alas, found amiss, abetting subprime shenanigans, impactico head crashing, befalling banking, finance, and humbling, resuming dismal, the fabled social science of economics, wrangling over what we best do about the unfurling crisis that majority econs never foresaw. Bigo biggest boom to bust since '29, and beyond mere humbling, but mega endangering once hallowed institutions in banking, finance, insurance, mortgaging, found over-leveraged, indebted, worsening, within credit crunched, nor just America but world over. And some went bust, whilst others were about to, unless governments also known as Guvo, on behalf of inflaming, enraging voting taxpayers, being told, having no choice, but to bail out bungling bankery, despite having helped cause the fiasco, among much other blameworthy, or else dare risk everyone, into revisiting the Great Depression, that mega marred, the 1930s, wretched, wiping out myriad livelihoods, made homeless, jobless, penniless, queuing hungry, near enough lingered on, depressing decade, so bad enough, over 75 years ago, and nor forgot, by governments in '08, who despite angering, into indebting taxpayers, deficit deepened, to decidedly bail out, backstop, guarantee, to rescuing, so many bankery world over, in America, Europe and Asia, embroiling such, and very much else. During what went on, way back then, to now over 10 years on, after enduring, mega myriad, econo publica politica disputation, venting vying vituperation, nigh on, Ramo rawing slugfest, being aplenty played out between them, whether broadcast, or online, or through print media, newspapers, articles, and spawning to date myriad books, umpteenth unfolding, for econo exploring about what went on, and still ongoing arguing about what was done, to what ought have done, socio-politica econo-cultural disputation, upon so much for attesting how important economics is, and most notably, when goes awry, crisis-riven, evermore embroiling, vexo-ventilating, vying economists, diametrica differboggling, at what Guvo ought do about the unfurling crisis in '08, for unlike other social sciences, such as sociology or psychology, it remains therein. Whereas a crisis in economics, everyone everywhere gets to take part, for we all know that economists can disagree, but now we are perchance entertained about who, how, and why so, especially through Kino, Hayek, and Milto arguing forth, powerful, compelling, pioneering, influential econo thinkers, enthralling now, re-enlivened to storyline, brought back to life, venting vividly, forejoining their mega myriad, present-day econo supporters, followers, and hangers-on, media sympathizers, for whatever, the econo supporter, invariably deep-felt driven, for fracas factional, supporting Kino, Hayek or Milto, headlong hurly wording, all thrown in, helping storylining, for dynamica exploring, economics, amplified, amid unfurling events in '08, along with bumbling bankery, hapless politicas, media mockery, and protesting publica, from flesh and blood human, to now reimagined, extrapolated, translated, into humo mechanica, revving robotized, within world afar, sci-fi film, but aside, the shiny metal, and whizzo-wacky inventive language, their econo-aggro remains close enough, sold back, into us, to hit home, entertaining to enlightening a mass, and how explosive economics can be, without the lasers or explosions, when the subprime risk in '08 was supposedly modeled away, until found afar from it when house values collapsed, backwash bedeviling banks, imperiling financial system entirety, endangering everyday livelihoods everywhere. For whizzo-wacky headlong Huron dynamica language abetted, venturing dare liberating econo discourse from academic environ, via innovative sounding, compelling, spoken within eye-catching sci-fi environ, repackaging to robotized storyline, translating what occurred in '08, tumbling to worsening, starty blasting crisis riven downward, from Bear Stearns, Lehman, AIG, and Mega More, unfurling events upon characters, having to respond within storyline, designed to ventilating economics, for mass consumption, viewing economics, seldom mistaking entertaining, but through sci-fi, helping, popularizing economics, shown why vital, whilst sci-fi tackling something serious, then more often not, squandering, usually wasting itself on shiny surface without substance, whereas mainstream sci-fi should more dare both together, alike now using robots and still looking good, but beyond the usual action-packed scenarios, to exploring something more relevant, resonant, and intellectually substantive, such as economics, for taking Milto at his word, that the economy after latest '08 fiasco is simply too vital to be left to economists alone, and so the story rhetorically arrays their opposing arguments, but invites, challenging, you the audience, to preside then decide what Guvos should or could have done in '08, and for our economica futures. Storyline explored to asking, whose econo theory you prefer, between Kino, Hayek, and including Milto, within story, conceived, planned, written and illustrated, by Andrew James Stewart, lay casual occasional economist reading author, who way back in '08, blithely bought into the bailout consensus else beget depressed, then later learning about the Keynes versus Hayek, mega most famous indeed infamous, long-running super spat, in 20th century going on 21st economics, between these two great economists, diametrica differing in their economics, amplified played out in '08 crisis, with their econo-aggro, upsetting his assumptions about economics, after learning more about the various arguments, enraging within it, intriguing him enough, thus endeavored, wrote forth, ambitioning movie to dynamica exploring, entertaining then maybe enlightening wider public discourse, and econo choices, which Guvo chose on their behalf, that he felt may be filmable, or at least now worthy rid up trying, ambitioning Zaggle Zooogle screenplay series.
As alike most people leading up to '08, I felt we were doing fine. And agreeing with majority mainstream media, newspapers, armchair onlookers, opinion formers, osonosos, whatever, that by and large everything was in hand, feeling that economically was tickety-boo doing fine. Thus, I ignored minority naysayers. As I always felt inasmuch as I assumed what I felt I knew. Enough to go along agreeing with Bernanke among other central bankery. And the generalized publica politica econo consensus that any subprime problems were localized being isolated would play themselves out without systemic knocking on affecting banking financial system entirety. Except from 2007, and evidently by 2008 Peter Schiff, among others, were proven right, and should have been taken perhaps a little more seriously, and that they did, especially with sort of Miso-Hayekian arguments, began enjoying more herd arising forth when attempting to answer Keynes. Having re-emerged in 2008-09 with governments worldwide adopting Keynesian interventionary monetary and fiscal agenda, along in part with his re-regulatory prescriptions. Spilling over to reviving or flaring up into Keynes versus Hayek ongoing squabble, arguing between them what Guvos best do, even spawning the famous rap video. In part, inspiring, helping to sow the seed within me, gestating through fits and starts, eventually writing up thus far. Exploring economics in 2008 through Keynes and Hayek Agro, including Milton, also known as in the storyline Kino, Hayek, and Milto.
So now, perhaps we should briefly outline some of the main agro, or in other words, differences between them regarding their economic thinking, most notably between Kino and Hayek, dominating the argument above Milto, or at least in the first part of this multi-part film series, for during downturns such as what began in 2008 that became the Great Recession, when the market economy contracts, ergo, soon enough drawing up the battle lines during unfurling crisis, demarcating between conflicting econo advice, implacably pitching interventionist Kino versus non-interventionist Hayek advice, Ramo rawing verily warring about what Guvos best to do, whereby business and consumer spending Kino believes that the market would simply take too long to recover itself, Reco reaping, causing too much damage, to be free market left be, in the short term, even to get to the long term worth having. Therefore, he advocated Guvo must step in, through monetary easing via credit and money creation, through central bankery, lowering interest rates, along with fiscal means, indeed favoring direct Guvo deficit spending into the economy, toward offsetting demand, back upward into recovery, and only then Guvo should cut back in surplus, as demand. Managed market Kino ethos argues, disagreeing against freer market Milto, especially Hayek, that to cut back spending during downturns merely worsens the downturn, whilst during such we afar ought spend back upward, and then cut back in surplus, when the economy has recovered. And certainly, in terms of spending, Guvos enacted him in 2008, buying up, rescuing, bailing out bumbling bankery, and much more, and even furthered beyond 2008, such as via Obama stimulus in 2009, direct Guvo spending on public works, near enough New Dealing, modern day updating what FDR did in 33, direct Guvo public work spending, and attempting to alleviate the Great Depression. For what FDR did in early 30s was justified by Kino, writing up general theory in 36. Essentially launching macroeconomic framework, enabling his interventionary ethos, justifying a greater role for more activist Guvo, for taking part, allying prudent regulation, for stewarding the economy away from its excessive lurching tendencies, which he prefers to answer soon enough, planning up wartime allied Guvos, then peacetime post-war furthered them, until his managed market interventionist orthodoxy was eventually curbed, from Guvo's 80s onward, adopting freer market more unfettered, expressly Milto prescriptions, against Kino Econo Aegis, who afar preferred, pursuing middle way, between socialism and unfettered free marketers, such as Milto and Hayek, whilst Kino justified enlarging Guvo, enacting his demand-managed agenda, through monetary and fiscal means, arguing for moderate, top-down, sensible Guvo planning, where felt needed, in the economy, along with allying judicious regulation of the market economy, and feeling he indeed Guvo well-intended knew enough for steering market capitalism, for serving the common good of society, against unfettered left to free market dogma, assumptions, and excesses. According to him, arguing can do too much harm, and leaving the economy to right itself, taking too long and causing too much damage. However, against managed market kino mendacity, markets work better when made freer, argues Hayek. Reducing Guvo, regulation and taxes releases greater freedom, liberty, enterprise, and prosperity, advocates Hayek, which his fellow, even more influential free marketer Milto would agree. Advocating free market Austro-economics, Hayek riles against kino demand managed macro agenda that, albeit well-intended, enlarges to justifying Guvo a far too fatal conceited through monetary, fiscal, and regulation, and trying to control upsy-downsy market economy too much, which Hayek argues, kino cum Guvo best left alone, especially during downturns, enabling the market correct itself, from investments found mal, that the market are better placed to address, cleansing its excesses, through reallocating resources, land, labor, capital more profitably decided than top-down Guvo, causing enough damage already in 08, according to Hayek. Blaming Guvo comes central bankery, not deregulation, for booming everyone busted, blaming the boom on the bust, thus best allowed to cleanse itself, without Guvo enacting kino, having already damaged enough, from too much easy money spending, low-rated fueled from uber ultimo blameworthy central bankery, according to Hayek, advocating saving up more balanced with spending, preferring the value of money, decided via market, rather than manipulated monetarily via central banking, monopoly fiat, a far too often encouraging spending, that can boom to bust us, and in essence, Milto and notably Hayek regarding 08 would a far more blame Guvo cum central banking than deregulated banks within market, whilst managed market kino prioritizes blame the other way round, arguing markets are imperfect, often fail, needing Guvo monetary also fiscal stimulate demand backup then cutback in surplus, completing kino counter fiscal monetary, moderate managed market agenda, whilst Hayek and Milto argue Guvo fails, being a far more culpable than markets, which best left be to longer-term free market amend themselves, without Guvo resorting to kino interventions, with kino preferring short-run addressing econo exigencies of the there and then, even to get to the long-term worth having. Thus kino greater justifies enrolling Guvo stepping in, interceding in economy when felt necessary, away from causing too much damage, and in part quantity theorist Milto agrees, interceding monetarily more than Hayek, who contends by doing so implies markets fail without Guvo core central bank amends, ergo undermining Milto's free market ethos that Hayek argues best decentralize money banking and rates, which from 80s onward was the one thing Milto forgot freeing up according to Hayek. In essence, unfurling 08 event storylines Milto, advocating monetary amends while kino includes fiscal, and Hayek argues neither, necessitating such clear-cut dichotomy, makes it more possible to thematically discussing, contrasting invariably already complex econo positions, core differences that divide them, exaggerated to storyline discussed between them, albeit not by much in being well-found arguments in 08 reality still argued over today, and events into econs also needing not that much to be fictionalized, except environed in homo-mechanica world, yet even then is like ours, bar the metal, all in all, ever worsening, unfurling events befalling characters, especially econs, arguing what Guvo's best do about the crisis, and by so doing, vividly storylined explicating economics, through ongoing conflicting argument, whilst too much agreeing among them, reduces what can be dynamica thematically explored, albeit not much really to worry consensus, about what best econo do, among Keynesians, Austrians, and Chicago, long-standing loggerheads, competing schools of economic thought, rugged remaining, important arguments ongoing today, and let alone, still ongoing arguing, about what happened way back during 1930s, the Great Depression, deeply informing their argument in 08 about how Guvo should tackle the financial crisis, with Keynes, who argued the central bank the Federal Reserve, needlessly raised rates in 28, contracting 29 boom to bursting, as he felt savings were aplenty, running ahead of investment, whilst Hayek argues the opposite, blaming easy money Fed policy prior to raising rates, being way too late to prevent the boom inevitably bursting, thus best allowed cleansed back up alone. And Milton sort of agrees Hayek prior 29, but argues Fed in 32 ought moneyed banks away from runaway depressing everyone worse, informing Ben in 08 not to risk repeating, monetarily intervening, liquefying banks then risk running away into depressing a mass again, angering Hayek arguing that 08 being no way as bad as 1930s, as way back then. Hayek blamed easy credit, whilst Milton stresses also blaming central bank, but for lack of money creation, that Ben Printo pressed agreed in 08 along with Keynesians, who in addition argued monetarily alone will not avert depressed, without more favored fiscal amends as well, or in other words way back 30s, deeply informs 08, with Ostros arguing nowhere nearing Great Depression being merely exploited by Keynesians, scaring central bankery stroke Guvo to justify monetarily, then fiscally redoing 33 via New Deal, except buying an indeed New Dealing bankery this time round in 08 via TARP, for undeniably in 08, having Guvo invoke Great Depression, powerful and persuasive driver, Publica Politica call to action, to justify Guvo fiscal and monetary interceding stepping in to offset market failure, according ultimo validating pre-emptive Keynesian ado, then laissez-faire bet on Chicago, and especially Austro arguments, for the looming specter of the Great Depression, ongoing haunts, exercises and informs, shaping still coloring contesting econo discourse, let alone 08 heightening the possibility of actually updating reliving it, thus deserving storyline discussed, undoubtedly, reflecting how serious the crisis appeared at the time. Enough for econs, resuming rawing about the 1930s, to defining them addressing what latest ought to do during 08, and albeit, their overall argument is more complex and expansive than insofar discussed here, but hopefully, you have now enjoyed some idea of the gist of some of their main opposing arguments, ergo econo agro, between Kino, Hayek, and Milto. Played out, sequenced within main steps, series of events in the story, plotting characters, rising arc conflicted through arguing, ratcheted worsening, amplified through unfurling events, starty blasting, expressly from Bear Sternico, Franklin Freddy, Lehman Bob, AIZ, TARP and much more, eventfully extrapolated escalating exaggerated, into comprising the overall spine that the story structure hangs on, to thematically storyline explore economics. Whether econ or not, all the characters befalling the event-driven story, to more or less degree, are written to discussing economics, in some way, whether public, protesting injustices, or those foreclosed, made homeless, camping en masse, or shouting out angry demonstrators, occupying Wally Wallet Street, and myriad media, broadcast, online, or print, reporting, discussing everyone, from central bankers, politicas, having to decide on bungling bankers to econs, Ramo wrestling to wrangling, over what Guvo best do, no matter who, arguing from glib to often articulating thematic complexity, exploring economics in some viewpoint, aspect, theory, practice, effects, fallouts, within past, present, or what the future may bring, socio, politica or culturally, as these characters, having something to say beyond popular sci-fi ambitions, from easy entry audience identifiable protesters, to often quite advanced Guvo, politica, sometimes risking econo-argued intricacy, such as Kino and Hayek, arguing, and wanting to overcome each other, defining characterizes them, and how they attempt going about it through unfurling event-driven story, by explicitly rawing forth, from econs, Guvo politicas downward, to everyday protesters arguing apace, Ramo rawing, in some way, all and often everyone, wanting their way against others, invariably getting in the way, perhaps, more than most other characters. Kino, Hayek, and Milto speak for themselves, as well as sort of being catch-all proselytizers, reflecting, invariably speaking to less or more degree, echoing their many and varied followers. Contemporary economists, storyline robotized in themselves, translating their discourse throughout story, such as post, new, textbookers, biographers, and hangers-on, enrolling Keynesiologian factions, mediated, headed via Kino, or monetarist Milto, mediating adaptive, rational expectico, Chicagoza factions, and Hayek, heading Austro factions, Misos, Hayekians, Rothbardos, free banking specialists, money mentors, maverick politica sympathizers, or any other Austro hanger-on, usually inclining, strong libertarian sympathies. Hayek, fronting Austros, Kino, fronting Kinos, and Milto, fronting Chicagoza, all three, competing schools of important economic thought, arguing forth against each other amplified apace, in responding to crisis-riven events within escalating story.
Within the story, Kino is portrayed as a somewhat haughty hybrid Edwardian, contrasting where he finds himself in modern-day 08. Almost as if he wandered into the 21st century yesterday, being largely unconcerned, invariably offending modern-day democratic pluralistic norms and sensibilities in order to get his way in, attempting to address the crisis. In being the product of his time and feeling assuming he knows what best do, and moreover what others should do. Pompous, paternalistic, patronizing, which he hardly recognizes within himself. But whatever he does or says, remaining well-intentioned, deep, felt feeling that he knows best. Formidable, dazzling, well-spoken, mellifluous, entrancing, compelling, and extraordinary personality, which I'm somehow trying to get across to convey some of his inimitable, astonishing, and undeniable essence. For whether loathed or loved, all economists would agree him being the most influential econo 20th century thinker, certainly the first part of the 20th century. And no matter what you think, everyone has to contend with him and his ideas, having helped shape the world foremost among economists, and then Milto, and other econs to some degree enjoying some influence, but wanting more. Hayek being Kino's long-standing most formidable adversary, but less successful in answering, or indeed curbing, Keynesianism, which from late 70s onward was done by Milton, who seized his opportunity in persuading Guvos adopting freer market policies, which Hayek approved, but would have preferred Thatcher and Reagan and other Guvos to more adopt his free market Austro bent, especially regarding monetary policy and wanting to free up banking rates and money away from Guvo central control. Hayek is portrayed as irascible but impassioning his motley minority Austro economics, arguing, attempting, thwarting Kino in at least putting the freer market argument far more forcefully than Milton manages, invariably shown on the back foot, being outside, having to respond to Kino inside, who enjoys more heated in answering the crisis than Hayek. And yet Hayek remains energetic, compelling, undaunted, doggedly fighting on. Against Kino versus Hayek is perhaps portrayed exaggerated a far more beyond his real-lived scholarly, yet contrarian persona, but less so his or his rival's economic argument. Being in this story the most important aim, whether with Kino or Milto or Hayek, in trying to portray him within roundabout, workably storylined, plausible Hayekian position, complementing his fellow Austro proponent Ludwig von Mises, brought together comprising sort of cobbling, yoking together Miso-Hayekian Austro economics today. And against Kino or Hayek, Milto is portrayed more affable, easygoing, democratic, approachable, and tends to talk to everyone in the same friendly manner, nor matter who or how young. Having to listen to his advocacy almost in the 80s, evangelical in promoting his free market aegis that was taken up. A powerful debater when needed, albeit largely in this story, he fails to counter Kino resurgence, and often somewhat sidelined by Hayek free market Austro-libertarian arguing with vim and vigor more vividly against Kino than Milto manages. For Milto through heading Chicago Za sort of represents within the story freshwater mainstream. Econo, politica, incumbency, free market, orthodoxy, Washington consensus, that Guvos adopted from 80s on against demand managed Keynesian era, whereby way back Western Guvos post-war demand managed Keno into orthodoxy until having no answer to stagflation, whereas Milto did from 80s on.
So, aside those three, vociferously supported by their econo followers, living today, many and varied, participating within story, arguing apace, helping explicating, econo-agro discourse, and also storyline including myriad others, protesting public, bungling bankery, politicas, Guvo gizmos, and the ever omnipresent myriad media mockery, irritating, often angering, virtually everybody, all in, flesh and blood, now robotized, translated to exploring, so much, deep felt, immersive, compelling, impassioned, vim and vigor, wit and wisdom, searing sarcasm, and so much more, engrossing discourse, going on, enraging disputation, all too homo, clashing, colliding into econo-agro, and even involving, colorfully conflating, Keno economics, with glassware serving as metaphor for his glento-spendo optimistic ethos, and Hayek, with meerkats and Stuka dive book bombing, and Milto, with Bungle among others, that he befriends, somehow, reflecting him and his televisual, evangelical free market proselytizing travels, enthralling, all in, escalating absurdity, within worsening, yet ever more serious, unfolding infernal fiasco, parody projected, into world afar, for selling economics, back into from where it came, entertain then enlighten you, every day a mass, about econo choices, made on your behalf, deserving, wider discussed, chancing made film, more challenging than the usual sci-fi fare, or at least now worthy trying, and hopefully, made more vivid, via casting, enlisting, everyone chosen relevant abetting story, whether Guvo politicas, media, bankery, and chiefly Keynesian, Austro, and Chicago econs, supporters, and their hangers-on, enlisted, within a cast list, all of whom, perhaps proselytize, in some way, defending and being publica politicas taken up, or wanting to, against the other, having not picked on, cast any econ, or anyone, preferring quiet life of blameless daily self-reflection or indeed teaching, without wanting to do one or more book, article writing, lecturing, groundbreaking theorizing, Nobel Prize awarded, podcasting, turbo tweeting, large website building, or conference speaking, moreover, often being interviewed, talked about, wanting or indeed suffering from a persistent desire to be taken seriously, head above parapet, publicly arguing to run or run down any central bank or any Guvo department office, institution, or anything needing a bailout or any other glaring but unmentioned econo reason. Indeed, it'd be fair to say that anyone already cast, and those awaiting redraft added later, having failed this criteria by some margin, not to be homo-mechanized, robotized, enlisted into script, endeavoring, interrogating, econo-body politica elite or educated class today.
For in so many words arguing over economic theory, these vying econs often accuse one another of unintended sci-fi, so maybe one day can be in this one. And admittedly, albeit somewhat unlikely, this will ever get made. And if ever it did, it'd be a long way down the line after it can be proven in selling a fair few copies to even countenance such. And yet, however stupid it may seem, I kind of having an inkling, maybe invite the econs, or at least ask them along with everyone else, cast to try and voice themselves, voicing their humo-mechanic namesakes, if some of them want to give it a try to voicing their character. But then again, perhaps not in requiring a specific performance that trained actors may better provide. Yet nonetheless, with many of them nor mere politicians, but modern-day myriad econs having become excellent, compelling, insightful, witty, funny public speakers, persuasive orators in their own right, thus some of them dare may be inclined, if asked, to give it a whirl. If I ever get that far, but right now it'd be a long way off, so they're not to worry. But I always think it'd be made more interesting if I ever get to the filmable stage and actually having them lending their voice in playing themselves being a far more authentic. For however far-fetched it may seem, chancing attempting through film exploring economics sold on to be adjudged by a mass audience. Invited forth for weighing up the relative merits, pros and cons of one particular econo theory versus another. Having resonance today invariably in terms of policymaking, if put into effect, can affect everyday livelihoods worldwide and the economic choices that governments choose on their behalf. For despite whoever storyline thrown and interrogated are weirdly taken seriously. Having to be written by myself, endeavoring as best I can in attempting some erudition and consideration, or else I wouldn't be able to mount to interrogate economics in any meaningful depth, or at least trying to. For the story being sometimes mere glib, but more often ambitioning aspiring as utmost I can. Storylining through screenplay core movie means explicating invariably complex debate in interrogating economics, but still attempting to be made entertaining and then perhaps enlightening. For unlike what goes for standard laser zapping or exploding sci-fi fare, exploring economics is somewhat harder to write toward trying translating it into a story ambitioning such as this. Having economics parodied sometimes descending farcical but not into itself, nor really personally cheap, petty, or malicious beyond profession, whether bank or econ, even politicians, whoever. For by and large being discussed proportionate to any character's public domain worth, and thus reflected within the story eventually in entirety, enabling them answering each other. For what they push out, they invariably get pushed back, ensuing roundabout tit for tat equal aggro points scoring against each other. All in all, balanced out eventually as the story arrays their opposing arguments, but lets the audience decide who be more right. Well, that's the idea anyway.
Language. Now, having you watching this thus far, along with listening, already having an inkling, hinting indeed, that whiz-o-bang dynamic, inventive and expressive language ergo dialogue, compellingly spoken via characters, is used throughout the story, or at least attempting, sounding interesting, through enlisting, whiz-o-bang words, voicing near visual, endeavoring to matching visual complexity, this time verbally, empowering mobilizing language pushed, reinvented, above mainstream sci-fi mores, perhaps, challenging audience, invited for imbibing dynamic dialogue, absorbing, and playful invention, speaking, sometimes, new words, lexicon, phrases, terms, terminology, stresses, senses, meaning, let alone what talked about, being economics, all in, sentencing words, often vividly volatile sounding, machine alluding, onomatopoeia, arrayed percussive, compelling, concise cadence, sometimes complex, but easy enabled, that can be fast spoken, often aided via gentle alliteration. Dialogue held together, nor just by words meant, but chosen sound with others, by felt near rhythmic melody, yet below some these sounds create together, as effective as what meant, striving sounding, as important as literal meaning, better enabling arguing econs whatever, sounding good enough, sufficing audience, than having to comprehend always exactly what is meant being argued over. Thus, through using such a linguistic device, hopefully, should enable characters storied on, thematically ambitioning, explicating often econo complexity, without alienating everyday audience, none the wiser, maybe suffice enough, that one bunch of characters disagree with the other, just as long as they super whirly whizzo bang, uber duper damn blastica sound, as captivating as they look. In essence, if spoken sounds all characters good enough, then it probably is in this instance, rather than the audience, having to understand, comprehend, every itty-bitty econo exactitude over why these characters disagree, and perhaps now best example spoken reality, via Austro-econ Tom Woods explaining ABCT that influenced author, who translated it for Hayek speaking forth in scene 42, contrasting reality versus homo-mechanized language.
Hayek wants to know, why is it that the economy moves up and down? One day we're doing great, the next day, we're not. For why does this happen when those people who had been great at forecasting consumer demand turn out to be terrible, all at the same time, in the same direction, Why? Why does this happen? You know, it demands an explanation. For the market weeds out people who stink at anticipating consumer demand. Those people make losses and go out of business. And people who are good at anticipating consumer demand expand and get more control of capital. For why, all of a sudden, do so many get all so bad? Actually, that is not Tom Woods, but it is sort of what he said to an audience.
As we austros, thinky poo ponderfluxing, ponder pooing, why oh why, having bomy busts happening, vraco regularly, racy raving whizzing upwards, then racy reversing, slamo bang downwards, upsy downsy 20th, into fluctuating 21st, ever more frequent, business pottery contractor flops, often alike, consumers, no longer gungling, yet why oh why triple why, headlong happening altogether, when the free market, ought weed out the losers found folly, in being bar do bad, at forecasting consumer demand, for surely, if business pottery, bankery, are bad at such, they make losses, and if even badder go busty flops, enabling capital in malinvestico reinvested, into other businesses, who may be no better, via moneyed are pre-used, by the free market but not top-down chosen where to go, if Valley Wall Street sneezes. For within, a soup air supposedly, unhindered free market, business pottery, producers, are competico competing, in everyday elections for consumer gunglers, casting their market votes, using their dollars, and those producers business pottery whoever, who competico succeed in profit, commandico more capital, Wisso winning whirling whiz bang. Thanks lamo bang. So, why so bankery? Business, producers, whatever, and so many, all of a sudden, begin making errors, breaking down, clustering up, piling atop each other, altogether, slamo bantangling, make losses.
So, compared to Woods, the Hayekian extract perhaps sounds more dynamic, near enough, leaping off the page that the story demands, yet both, sort of say similar, and neither better, when taking into account, and merely being appropriate to situ indeed context, with Woods, sober lecturing in reality, whilst Hayek, sci-fi robotized, storylined addressing press in New Yorkie fed, for in terms of sci-fi or fantasy, if wider exploited, can enjoy more latitude to verbal invention than other genres, for the language schema, prevailing the story, inventively or attempting, and harnessing the power, rhetorical capability, and ingenuity of language.
Having not invented another language, but am trying pushing it as far as I mainstreaming feel I can, without completely alienating, losing, loosey flopping the audience, as it were. In having to listen, comprehending an adroit, almost breezy atop surface, often sounding pop art near enough throwaway postmodern kitsch, perhaps almost analogous alike 60s capo cartooning Batman and the like idiom superhero, throwaway, slamo, whizzo, bang, spoken milieu. But in this instance, not excluding deep feltment held, designed to discuss economics, often furthering finessing their already econo jargon stroke, lingo made maybe nicer sounding but serious satire, endeavoring saying something, melding substance with style, enthralling vividly verbally cartoony fireworks. Perhaps, in an initially hearing it, it may be off-putting, sounding too weird, even babyish. But hopefully, in due time, the audience should soon enough become acclimatized into greater understanding, keying and comprehending, being challenged into getting more out of it. Well, all in all, with language, indeed dialogue. Trying to push it as far as I can feel to popular plausibly to get away with. For that be the idea anyway. For being about economics as it is. Having nothing to lose, so why not best try being spoken with whirling, wacky words. Hurly-wordy heading headlong to try, triple try it out. Trying it on perchance, less boring than standard spoken common fare.
Obviously, what the story looks like, and some of it already shown, and a plenty mock-up pre-production pictures, recognizably sci-fi in this instance, re-envisaging organic earth-formed metallic, comprising iron, steel and bronze, prevailing over reddish copper, or yellowy gold, all in, coloring and shaping worldwide metallic, starring, most notably, mechanized human beings, with females known as sockets or fembits, and male screwdrivers or malbots, with triangular bases, replacing legs to thigh-belted dressed upward, ensuing, usually clothing, human-like, torso and arms, leaving hands, neck and idealized sculptured faces bare, who speak but only open mouths when eating.
A sci-fi revving robotized aesthetic environing the story, good-looking, eye-catching, decorating the thematic content, being near enough flesh and blood economics, but made better-looking visually, more palatable to stomach economics. Or hopefully made at least going down easier for the audience, with the aesthetic being the one clear-cut, unambiguous crowd-pleasing popular concession against plot, character, and particularly language, and theme re-economics. And perhaps it be noteworthy that these bots, robots, cyberbots, call them what you will, are designed as they are, shunning human robotized bipedal movie orthodoxy to embody seldom used footless trianguloidroid form, thus manifestly necessitating ramps and lifts replacing stairs and ladders, within a world distinguishing them more robotic, but still remaining by and large physically familiar enough to our own.
Arguing for something against another, being polemic one way, whilst arguing the other way as well in this story is thus made two-way, thus perhaps made more considered, through chiefly equalizing, Kino-Hayek rhetoric, ensuing econo-agro equilibrium, held in check, through reciprocal arguing against one another, overall balanced out. In this way, the story is argumentatively more considered, without being unduly worthy, for unlike polemic the story evolved, and trying to balance Kino-Hayek agro, nor suggesting that polemical arguing one-way point of view does not have a place or any way less valid, noble or better than here. But in this instance, the storyline scheme is trying to be considered, inviting audience judge their respective econo positions, enabling the audience decide conspicuously between Kino versus Hayek, albeit in the last part of the series, Milto gets equal footing. This rhetorical schema roughly charts words spoke largely by Kino, Shikagoza, and Austro-econs, loosely equating 46%, 8%, and 46% respectively in words core time spoke among them, advocating against or rarely agreeing with each other, or in other words, through albeit crude screen time between them is vital, and that rhetorical storyline time taken positions left unanswered can easily skew audience, thus overall are usually answered back by the end of the story, especially between Kino v. Hayek. But, as already said, in the final part of the series Kino, Austro, Shikagoza will enjoy 33% each, finally leaving audience judge them equal-footed, rather than the story itself, that arrays their econo arguments, without siding with one or the other.
Well, that's sort of the idea anyhow. For perhaps all of this yoking billeting me as the author, however fallible, as referee presiding over all what writ in the story and that I chose what went in, thus arranged so. But hopefully not some grand arbiter beyond it, being too high a burden for a shambling lay econo-chancing sci-fi screenplay writer as I am, but still having a go-through film, maybe help widen popularize an ongoing often flaring up ferocious important econo debate, an ongoing remaining relevant today between some of the great major vying schools of economic thought.
For the story, marshalling rhetorical means, the art of persuasion largely through language, expressly, via this verily voicing venting literary film, enabling the characters, especially econs, speaking, arguing forth, usually through addressing media to camera, throughout the story, allowing them, invariably explicitly argue forth, entering, within an almost veritable Game of Thrones indeed persuasion, to convince the other, or more so Guvo Politicus, or wider public, chorus, the viewing audience, over what best econo do. During the 08 event-driven crisis, via tit-for-tat, seesaw arguing their validity against the other, via ethos, pitos and logos, rhetorical stratagem, appealing to us, of their supposed econo truth, against each other, arguing, rhetorically, often via pitos, appealing above facts, to our emotions, feelings, gut instincts, sentiments, sense of identity, and endeavoring to win us over to their cause against the other by persuasively arguing through language, rhyme and rhythm, repetition and restatement, guilt by association, listing, exaggeration, anecdote, mudslinging, insult and invective, labeling, ladders, comparison, fearmongering, co-opting higher authority, humor, mockery, ad hominem, sarcasm and irony, and no doubt could loosely name many more rhetorical tropes, such as, and perhaps, the most important of all, that of, by delivery, how the message through language is delivered, super-sounding, enthralling, engaging, above what actually said, when best said in style, verve, vim and vigor, nice-sounding, whiz-o-bang in how spoken, impelling, impact, captivating, compelling, and how, the way you say it, more than what you say, for whatever, the rhetorical trope, from anecdote to sarcasm, being enlisted, for appealing to us, via quite often, above facts, to our feelings, foremost, in trying to win us over, to their particular bent, but all in, whether facts or feelings, through them, from econs including politicas, attempting to persuade us of their validity against each other, arguing forth, to and fro, endeavoring, whether right or wrong or deceptive, by whatever means, to win us over, via using rhetoric, being merely a device, a tool, of persuasion, morally and ethically neutral, for it be the speaker that imbues it in whatever they wish, for selling their message, and trying to persuade us to their particular point of view, and in part, the rhetorical schema, being taken or inspired from econo discourse that was already out there, but simply needed to be herein writ up exaggerated enough, thus enabling, fueling to inflaming, tripartite counter-reciprocal agro-engine to keep on fired up, whiz-o-bang whirling, chiefly, between combustible, competing econs, vying schools of econo thought and writ and spoke opinion. For this story is an econo-politica crisis-riven parody, exaggerating events and discourse that took place over a decade ago, then completely invented. Exaggerating flesh and blood, warring worded writ up robotized, and flamed to framing aggro, within media today, turbo tending, headlong herding, pugilistic pinning into pitting, one against indeed versus the other, verbal punch-up, slugfest, shootout, as if beyond warring wording to warring, and flaming embattled, and speaking to one another, as if in losing ground, or taking it back, attack or counterattack, back and forth, offend or defend, retreat or regroup, speaking, almost as if, on military maneuvers, then merely arguing about the economy, whether from politicas or econs, with notably Americansian media, as it is, and framing their argument as if at war, to win at all cost, whilst in truth, a far better to win over someone, or perhaps, if not other econs within the story, but the audience, into agreeing their point of view. For winning, an argument in terms of a fight leaves a loser, angry, resenting, and later on may argue indeed fight back, for the argument does not go away when the anger behind it invariably remains, whilst winning someone over to your argument reduces it from returning, and if it does may be less forceful, for putting aside the warring wording hype, the story in truth, a race, not a war, but an argument between econs, preferring not to win, but to win over, perhaps, not other econs, but appealing to the more biddable, wider viewing audience, to their particular point of view, one round, to their argument, which even Kino mentions in the story, for all econs, deep felt driven, care about the economy, to argue about, a far more so than truly fight over, as if warring risking to destroy, in order to win, for whatever be the econ, the economy is the one one thing they care and share about, toward a common interest in wanting to improve it, rather than be a battleground. Moreover, why we have politics, defining them, to argue, to settle what we ought do, than recourse to warring arms, being even worse. Thus, albeit on a lower level, needing politicas, deciding between econs, economic crisis, amid the rhetoric, hue and cry hubbubs.
And in truth, in some regards, we all use rhetoric in our daily discourse every day talking to each other for getting our point across, but merely is usually a far slicker and compelling when found in advertisements, promotions, political oratory, speech-making, being interviewed, and such like, or indeed made entertaining within a narrative from songs, books, to film. That can be a powerful, persuasive communication toolset as tried on, as screenplay writ here for argumentatively help exploring selling economics, inviting a mass judge between competing econo schools of thought that can impact upon everyone enough to maybe go see a film about it, or then again, maybe not. And in returning to rhetoric, for many teachers, educationalists bemoan in being no longer formally taught, when studying English pushed out increasingly having no room for rhetoric in the curriculum. And more so the pity, as we all best taught to more recognize the techniques used by the writer or speaker behind the car, add to politician from book to film. Invariably, in all senses, selling you something that may be valid or less so, but still feels compelling. For perhaps many economists prefer or hanker for being seen to be conducting a cool, calm, rationale, dispassionate dialectic regarding the economy. For publica, politica nearing scientific consumption for what we ought do, almost as if we can all converge upon one answer. A far rather than rhetorical arguing, descending into often feeling what Guvo best do with many more econs felt forced to. Especially those who sort of mistook themselves as scientists up until 08 occurred. For if the facts go against them having so much theorized to taught, argued invested in the theories they have yet can still feel such and such to explain away what happened arguing at opposing econs. Ergo, to feel one way or the other, it can still be valid. Often within economics finding yourself resorting to thus. Being reminded of being a social science, it's still okay to feel this and that, having more licensed latitude than hardened science to do so. And moreover, aside economists, those that reported them the mainstream media, played along enough to be not entirely overlooked in the story. For running up toward 08, they kind of majority cultivated everything was fine up until 08 found not. Thus forcing themselves, albeit belatedly scrutinizing the system, but not out of any great sagacity or proven foresight. And perhaps, even still, maybe somehow sort of assumed in solutioning problems in its own terms, then availing alternative econo arguments outside of it. And because the main media, whatever politica bias mostly assumed went along to 08 norms, could not so easy point score at one another, thus preferred easier target bungling bankery, rather than dare self-scrutinize their own reporting role over how we got to 08. Being still underreported today enough now to be storyline discussed, mainly through Dello meeting econs later on in the final part of the story. For we all know media are not innocent and less practiced when polishing trusty sacred swords of supposed shiny truth and wisdom, yet still not always enough for catching their searing self-reflection. Maybe cutting too close to the bone at their own contribution to a far prefer gloss over what they said prior to 08. Enough now deserving, or at least somehow trying to storyline, include scrutinizing their role, then storyline dumping everything upon a bunch of squabbling econs. For despite all their faults being many at least econs and their hangers on a far more consistently adhere about their studied subject, rather than journalese often middling finessing to diametrically forgetting what they opined yesterday, thus deserving some sort of storyline scrutiny. For undoubtedly myriad voices shaping media nebulous indeed shapeless, but still surely shaped wide opinion toward, during and after the 08 crisis enough to have played a role within it, contributing to how we got there, and in many ways, ongoing assuming various states, yet sort of maintaining the status quo. And yet, no doubt all agreeing everyone became smarter after 08, but alas, more independently, insightfully needed prior, which afterward is not entirely made up for enough for this story to not completely overlook what was common held assumed before the bust. Ergo, the media, having played along, having playing a role toward 08 and beyond storyline deserving and examining their role, albeit often difficult to pin down, but within especially the last part, I shall somehow endeavor more so harder and for scrutinizing reporting on their reporting.
One part of 3. So, as no doubt gathered, this story is the first of 3 parts, making up in totality the film Zaggle Zooogle Zankeedoodle Abridged. Part 1. Storylines reporter, watching TV with us about 08 subprime crisis, in preparation to meeting Kino and Milto later. And then Part 2. Storylines reporter, on learning Hayek is also coming, watches TV with us of historic econo documentary, covering from 1883 to 2008 about Kino, Milto, Hayek, in preparation to meeting them later. And finally, Part 3, Storylines reporter eventfully meeting them, ensuing econo-agro showdown, slug out, where much occurs, but undisclosed here how it ends. Other than affirming unlike punch drunks, none of them provide each other with a moment of clarity, nor ends well. But if they can't decide between themselves, maybe you, the audience, can, invited forth, to decide at least the first part, and in so doing, somehow, liberating economic discourse from the economist to be wider adjudged by a mass. And, as no doubt gathered, this 3-part abridged series is taken from a somewhat bigger, more intellectually aggressive, unabridged series, which is not discussed here. The economics, if filmed, inaugurates econo genre, or adds to generalized financial crisis or business genre, but more glaringly recognizably in robotized splendor, being foremost a science fiction story, and yet strangely, almost made incidental, when dynamically spoken, filled in enthralling economic discourse, gracing this sci-fi epic, certainly thematically more challenging than invariably emptier, robotized, action-packed, sci-fi cinematic counterparts, typifying ever more consumable mayhem, without much character or theme, whilst hereon aspires, endeavoring, compelling complexity, discussing economics through robots, than mere customary shoot-'em-up slugfest conduits, essentially action vehicles, satisfying audiences commercially, yet creatively narrowing sci-fi today, ever more enacting CGI possibilities, high-actioned nigh on into itself, reducing ambitioning in story, character, and theme, to exploring ideas afar less, despite still visiting worlds anew, whereas perhaps can means further, ambitioning past, action-packed concepts, to explore more complex ideas, and maybe, more dynamically, than everyday earthly reality constraints, through serious sci-fi, nor privileged, above majority sci-fi fare, but hereon, merely striving for greater purchase, to winning a mass audience, for discussing something somewhat more difficult, taxing, challenging, out of the ordinary.
Nominally, as a sci-fi fan ensuing script, writing bent, but I find myself today no longer much liking sci-fi film near enough at all, with ever more surface spectacular dominated starting from Star Wars 77 onward. Nor saying does not have a place, but ought not action-packed to seemingly monopolize entirety, thus denuding the genre of its dynamic versatility potential power to more exploring higher denominated than invariably pander to common-held sci-fi received norms. For serious sci-fi, for want of a far better word, should renew ambitioning, spearheading, fighting back, specially into mainstream earning greater purchase than cinema shown today. Or at least trying to, in this instance, interrogating economics through sci-fi means. Engaging a mass audience, as we all have to participate within economy enough to care about, maybe now enough awaiting big picture film. Engaging a mass interest alike, Harry Potter conjuring hocus-pocus theory. But arguably, not that much more incredible than a far less benign econo theory impacting everyday reality worthy now, maybe filmable. For if only mainstream film, alike 1970s era, could more often dare harness its compelling power for wider exploring harder issues as successfully does with softer issue, more usual easy, entry standard fare.
The screenplay, hopefully writ palatable, flowing readable, without camera directions, scene transitions, or many other needless scripted formatting, which may put off readers from trying it out, being already about economics as it is, with the script, aligning lines, annotated in text, stressing and describing felt characters, action and situ, often illustrated, all in melding lines, text, and images, not competing, but complementing each other, working together, for selling the screenplay holistic, as storied whole, awaiting its big picture tell us, thus, on the outset, is more amenable, for wedding words with imagery, than novels are, and relying on words alone, nor necessarily, speak finer, but the mock-up pictures, still speak 1,000 words, than having to write down laborious burdened, in describing all, whilst the pictures at least lighten the load, liberating words to better do what pictures cannot. The screenplay may work quite well, allowing audio play, made to complement it, in page flicking through, whilst listening to the text, and especially line dialogue, being spoken, voice acted forth, as wrote out for at least voiced, than fully movie visualized that may not happen, but worthy getting this far to be heard, and moreover, the lines alone if mere heard, perchance spoken voices all vivid enough within mind's eye, at least cheaper writ than multi-million-dollar visualized if ever filmed.
For a sci-fi screenplay being about economics, having nothing to lose but try as far as one can to selling it for exploring economics. Chancing another way than '08 crisis in myriad books, not competing but complementing their worthy writ with one albeit unfilmed screenplay.
From boom to eventually housey bubble bursting, onto bankery found hubris in '08 that Centros failed foresaw at low-rated coming, among majority state-of-the-art econo modeling. Super supposedly designed to prevent such bumbling bustery from happening, yet appear to do the very opposite, risking everyone, perchance revisiting the Great Depression, embarrassing, whatever the econ, above blaming each other, to all agree that their subject failed among politicas, bankery, and public at large, engaged enough to now maybe merit film, availing voting viewers more choices than maybe first thought, via viewing a story that asks rather than answers what should have done past, present, or future economics is best to do, colliding contentious, enrolling enthralling verily vital socio-econo publica politica debate, rampaging on in disputation, just as long as we have an economy to argue about, ensuing we still have to endure, the fabled so-called often dismal, yet mega important, social science of economics, enlivening econs and public realm, such as notably since '08, vying aplenty one another, but strangely felt refreshed, despite humbled via subprime crisis, which nobody wished, destroying jobs, output, indebting a mass, bailing out bungling banks, etc. But it happened, exciting econs rawing to raking over econo theory, dubbing their latest self-examined disaster the Great Recession, being not felt that great despite decade distanced, for as ever, cannot help themselves being econs, after all at least trying their best, in so many words often inciting not the economy being the problem, but other econs, which we all may agree but cannot decide between them, hence this story may help in presenting them, but not deciding who be more right or wrong, when left to the audience to judge them, weirdly democratic for a story availing educated elites. Whether in banking, guvo, politicas, or those academic opinionated innocents econs, who alike others ought more answerable after '08, for when the economy tanks economists are preoccupied, nor merely by blaming each other, but by everyone else wanting to know what and how happened, and why majority econs failed foreseeing '08, thus must accept and nowadays more readily do accept some responsibility, else why have them? Competing econo ideas and ongoing economy, argued over way back century to today, and no doubt futures waiting to be argued over, having an economy thus having to endure conflicting economic schools of thought, Keynes, Austro and Chicago among other econo groupings, and worthy scrutinized, when their respective theory is or could be, to less or more extent, if guvo politica implemented wider, often having huge import upon livelihoods everywhere, worthy enough perchance filmed, and while, whatever the economist, can be portrayed whatever way, in whatever art form the story attempts some consideration, care, and respect in trying to present, putting across some of their main conflicting arguments, and by so doing, often mocking them, and deserving so, but preferring not pure mockery for its own sake, whilst a far prefer allowing them their say, for venting their erudite verve, storyline exploring their undoubtedly extraordinary subject, important, expansive, maddening, mind-boggling, atop much more, as fabulous as it can be frustrating, yet still fascinating them to care, argue indeed advocate about how best to econo go forward, which we all have a stake in, within a story, laughing at them but also with them, and acknowledging their vainglorious burden, especially yoking those enlisted cast, evidently enthralled, for dare attempting, fathoming the economy, dealing with politicas, let alone having to endure, opposing each other, before they can even thankless get any further toward what they want, but still, their deep-felt driven trying, availing choices, that ought wider discussed, chancing movie made irreverent yet celebrates them, not written, for their approval, as 400 econs will agree into 4,000 opinions cannot be catered for, but storyline tries to get something useful out of them, for a mass consumption, for exploring econo choices made by Guvo, on behalf of everyone, and no doubt, in truth already knowing economics is vital, but herein deeper explored why so, for whether right or wrong-headed, econs have at least thought, advise, study, theorize, about the economy, enough to deep-felt invariably discuss, going on to seemingly endless disagree at what we best do about it, alike those enlisted cast. Thus this story takes them at their word, distilling their main aggro fought out between Kino, Milto, and Hayek, allying their supporters, all thrown in, being storylined, rid down, to where the rubber hits the road, being a movie after all, requiring a point to all this unfurling discourse, unlike some econs, who talk a good talk about change, but prefer talking to each other, whilst Tehran takes them at their word, affording no hiding out from this inescapable engine, movie marshalling, trying to have it out, to a mass dialogue made entertainment, risking to enlighten, about economics impacting everyone every day everywhere, shown how vital economics is, in this ever-materialistic world, without being much finer than fellow social sciences, especially after latest 08 fiasco humbling economics whatever school, for above, disagreeing among themselves, having to collegiately agree, their much vaunted subject did not fare very well, joining politicas, banking, among media, within lowly public esteem, and that it often does, but not saying economics be all wrong, stupid and worthless, for much worth and achievement has been won, through the subject notably 20th century on, helping Guvo's winning market economics, against politica extremes, to by and large, every day everyone enjoying some progress, winning, worthy gains, notably billions out of poverty, enjoying much all agreed, to be held on to, stumbling steps forward, then a few steps back, most notably in recent memory in 08, and if dare viewed through bookish literary terms, uniting some plot-driven genre fiction, allying literary fiction of character and theme, risking complexity, inviting audience judge between vying econo-aggro, challenging audience imbibe above clean-cut genre, or indeed unambiguous served-up accessible ending. Ergo storyline told what occurred, but if aught of in that way being more ambiguous, impressionistic aspiring literary fiction, yet plotted slickly dressed up in popular genre fiction, or maybe best call it crossover genre, sci-fi to economics, postmodern storylining deconstructing the vaunting, ambitioning to be great, and wanting to be seen more useful, the social science of economics, born aloft ever more vital, that nobly tries to understand our materialist age through econo-exigencies, alike other social sciences, such as sociology, joining science medicine, engineering etc., arising from rationalist enlightenment to modernist progress, now replaced in postmodern dissecting. Much of these achievements such as economics in this story, escalating mocking and much more hurled at economics, and yet the story still offers readers with cogent econo choices to buy into, than postmodern taking the story so far as to self-indulgent deconstructive eat itself, and to merely being interesting without having to offer up anything to choose from.
And pray allow me against you all assuming that I somehow resent or indeed loathe economists. But far from it, for in the process of writing this, having for myself for now, learning there are invariably no easy answers. For what is can be a complex economic debate, allying the socio-political sphere, all enthroned in becoming a bewildering thing, more overt discourse, that I'm trying to distill down to wrestle somehow into a cohesive story, a sellable narrative. For in the writing, I myself having become more respecting of economists with their troubled yoke being a difficult endeavor, in trying to make some sense of the economy, and then having to engage somehow with the political process, thus in part mauling whatever their econo theory intended when it's taken up as policy. For it's always in part a bit of a mess in dealing with politicians. But still, that not be an argument not to try, when the stakes whether Keynes, Chicago, and other economic schools of thought play out for high stakes that can affect a mass above any other social theory can then enjoy being greater heard. Ergo, having a livelihood partaking market economy, having lifted worldwide billions out of absolute poverty within the few last decades, is an extraordinary achievement thanks to market economics. And only then more of us can enjoy affording psychology or philosophizing after first off having a roof overhead and table for eating off, to then worry about anything else. For economists having their respective theories, whatever their econo bent taken through politica policy mangled, let alone vying each other yet played out for big stakes, however econo policy messed up, but still worthy for caring and fighting about the economy. Enthralling economists way beyond normal people, whilst deep felt these economists are especially starring those enlisted cast ubiquitous, erudite impassioned, engaging fallible human, and remaining on the front line of econo debate, played out for big stakes, arguing that if enacted can affect a mass to worthy argued over for. Or else, why bother? As super surely economics really matters for serving every day, everywhere a mass, and can invariably engage them often very angry when it goes wrong, with the everyday public ear-bending many an econ left to explain what happened, with aplenty everyday public out there wanting to listen and read up about it. For alike, no other subject econs have an audience, prompting many econs afar preferring talking wider than talking to each other and getting absolutely nowhere with. For super surely above any other social science or any other academic subject to that matter, enjoying more talked and argued about verily ventilated, enthralling exercise fabulo, fascinating, exciting. Economists studifloxing the market economy, engrossed over how it whizzo-bang-whirly works, allocating capital land labor to where most needed to making goods and services at the right amounts, the right place, time, and price. The market economy wheezo working by and large quite well without economists who all agree so but some less than others, manifesting market versus freer market econs. Or indeed bigger guvo versus smaller, indeed less interventory approach. All in at least arguing today in accepting the market economy whilst way back 30s to 40s Keynes and Hayek fought each other, often being mindful of how best deal against left and rightward extremists, along with depression, reminding us today that we have got somewhere thanks to market economics defeating such left and rightward extremist alternatives. Albeit China could maybe ask us today why need representational democracy to have market economics. For so far, communist-ruled China has done rather well atop a market system, enriching them within a mere generation, although easy gains had. May not be easier one further when closing into Western developed standards. Ergo, a mass Chinese may demand more say when their mega growth inevitably slows down to more contentious, erratic, upsy-downsy Western norms. And surely 'tis still better best having almighty China, having progressed, gone so far, having achieved so much when connected up within market economy, by and large for better and perhaps later on will loosen up toward greater Western democratic norms in the long term. All within market system, enabling people, no matter language, creed, culture, cooperating in mutual self-interest, evermore, largely peaceably brought together, interlinked without never having to know each other. Enriching one another in trade, rather than trading bombs being surely a far better thing today in having distant people yet globalized, narrowed into market economics, and argued about within the remaining econo schools, or factions, Keynesianism, Chicago, Ostro's public policy choice, real business cyclists, behavioral economics, and no doubt among other market economic groupings or alternatives. surely being testimony, especially long-standing Keynes Austro-Chicago schools, to their enduring ideas. For more or less degree surviving and depending on who you ask remain relevant, rather than too much bother about Marxism or fascism. Near enough defeated into nowadays, rid up history unlike this lot. Revving relevant to some degree as a choice to choose from unlike a far rightward or leftward extremist. Being somewhat reduced today to objects of kitsch curiosity, colorful documentary, exciting branding clothing, but no longer really having any publica politica per purchase as a politica economic alternative for replacing the market economy. For despite being often rhetorically invoked in the story would not really right now in foreseeable futures will ever return, or in this context would not merit filmed as an economic choice to be taken up for today. But of course film can be about anything and say what it will. But in this case, having tried pulling together piece by piece, jigsawing some of the remaining plausible econo-competing aggro, pieced together made a piece in satire parody, yet storylines still serious enough for floating their opposing arguments amplified in '08. Strangely celebrating economics ennobled in disaster, as only it can that it never much foresaw. Thus dragging everyone else, joining in and angrily partaking nigh on dare, chancing for risking everybody everywhere, to reliving 1930s, Reco reflecting how bad it became. And even having Her Majesty, whilst visiting LSA Econs, she asked them exactly why they mega missed the biggest boom to bust since '29. Impelling them writing back that lots of very clever people can collectively get stuff wrong when dealing with such econo-complexity that comprises the modern-day economy. Being of course very true, but ought remain more humble, and if movie made maybe help to remain mindful of their limitations. And perhaps we all should, for when the housey banking boom went bust, alike many afterwards, I myself was left looking in at what happened, taken aback to writing thus far, and agreeing maybe a far too enjoying after decade on after the fact being all too easy to mock economists and their extraordinary subject. Economics thrown forth, vying vainglorious, putting itself out there, for at least try fathoming economic activity. That politica to voting-wielding public engrossing expectation, fanned via media, maybe all of us, for we all maybe ask and still do asking too much of econs, many of whom being shopped by politicas to promise too much above and beyond what their subject can realistically achieve. Most recently from 2000 onward, and then found humbled in '08, enthroning beginning failing expertise, soon joining the politica environ furthered from mispredicting Brexit or Trump winning, or Corbyn heading Labour. So-called impossibilities now found possible attesting, we are all living in astonishing, unfurling, uncertain, tumbling testing times indeed. Being a terrible decade for experts found afar from it, within a decade of disappointment and distrust, starting downward from '08, having still today in 2020 not entirely recovered from. So maybe now awaiting film scrutinizing economics via economists through their latest fiasco in '08 found too significant this time around beyond their squabbling, when affects everyone else enough perhaps worthy filmed. And although I'm not an economist, maybe still chancing I know enough to have a go distill economics into movie. Perhaps ahead of intellect, but not vaulting ambition to at least like to think I'm looking in on economics. In wrestling grappling, trying to make sense of to explore attempting through storylining, reaching out for wider outward mass consumption of their extraordinary, diverse, difficult, diffuse economic disputation, taken extrapolated from there to there, from him to her, whatever, whoever widely source for, pulled together, made narrative. Marshalling to melting pot, melded, forging from itty bits and pieces, storyline pulled together, made a piece. Mayhap enough engage a mass above econs politicas bankery, whatever being the subject, not the audience. Uber ultimo being those amassing wider who am aiming for writ toward, but the more complex a do, the deeper one delves reducing my innocence come chancing curiosity that won me writing up thus far, and yet I'm still less blamable than any supposedly academic innocent economist, having much to answer for. And even enough, at times, dare pity the politician having to decide between them. But now inviting you lot have a go to decide who you econo prefer, between Kino Milto or Hayek and their respective econo supporters, advocates, proselytizers, followers, hangers on whatever. And no doubt, I ought apologize on their behalf as well. For we all agree they can be insufferable. but we have to suffer them in at least trying to understand the economy which everyday taxpayers partake in. Perchance deserving greater voice if shown wider choice over what best we econo do now and into the future. So in summary, over what I've had to say, in telling or indeed telly-welling you all about the story without actually telling you what happens between Kino Hayek and Milto. Almighty econo-thinkers inducing guvo from less or more extent their influence impacting upon us today for good or bad. And no doubt a green Keynes who observed most politicians or politica bureaucrats are invariably enslaved to carrying out some theory that came from an economist, and most notably from his good self via Samuelson supporter post-war quipping that voters can decide the guvo just as long as he gets to write their economic textbooks, which Hayek would no doubt sorely agree enough to tolerate Milto from 80s on persuading guvos adopt him to curving Keynes. So now, after all said, being invited left to you for finding out if so, wish via first part what rid up so far exploring economics. But if had enough up to here, then thanks for watching for getting at least this far being about economics, for as it is enjoying low expectations at the best of times. But at least we won the Great Recession plucked out of the jaws of what may have become the Great Depression, being a victory of sorts, but needing an economist to tell us that for alas, we'd all agree it was not that great, but this time, at least it was the Great Recession, and surely worthy of celebrating the most important and extraordinary social science subject of economics, for after all, what hullabaloo horrendous happened, deserving perchance asking. For super, surely maybe now there be a movie in all of that after what went on. And for those, especially economists, having putting themselves out there enough to get themselves noticed to be enlisted worthy cast, along with bankers, govos, politicus, policymakers, to myriad media talking heads endless opinionated far and wide, having kind of earned their place through what they've done contributing to the debate in some way, in getting themselves noticed, to be found of wider interest beyond themselves, to be storylined useful. For I myself, having written them and included them being felt of some merit to the story, and hoping they would think so, and if not at least maybe ought take some solace, that I felt they be of some worthwhile to be storyline included. For as Oscar Wilde would say, there is only one thing worse to getting noticed, and that is not getting noticed. And all in at least there, all in together, thrown in felt relevant abetting the storyline. For having tried to portray them, to do them some justice worthy of their endeavor, their enthusiasm, their effort, and their energy, whether misplaced or not. They're clearly ever keen putting themselves out there in whatever media advocating, debating, ongoing squabbling about their subject above and beyond mere classroom teaching or being listened to by their spouse. For whether right or wrong, they're at least trying their best to make sense of the economy, being still, after all, said a serious subject, making economics the jumped-up yet still most important social science despite its myriad failings. In often laid bare, but remained surely a far more valid, noble, and useful than studying tawdry politics. Enthralling was though whirling enough now after all, what's gone on maybe one day in the fitful future awaiting film. No doubt the final frontier, after being argued umpteenth writ up, even wrapped about to now, at least via unfilmed screenplay, find out if there be a market for such to justify if could be commercially made. That no doubt all econs would aptly agree enough to end on agreeing something. Enthralling movies starring Kino Hayek and Milto Agro, superselling their competing cure going on econo-vision for forging finer future. Being written storyline together. Drawing influence indeed inspiration for what I know of them and what I think may work within story. Finding myself often finessing, summarizing their advocacy and what they want and how they want to get to it. And perhaps regarding Kino ultimately wanting to get everyone through the crisis via guvo means, and then toward easing off capitalism to launching a better life agenda. Whilst Hayek argues after managed market Kino era, then freer market Milto era, we now surely need a third revolution in decentralizing monetary policy, core money banking, and rates away from top-down manipulated when ought free marketed. Ensuing economic freedom won back not through bullets, but through ultimo money. Being the one freedom that Milto inferred, we weren't free to choose which Ostros wished to complete, favoring more econo-libertarianism. for surely amongst much else already discussed. For I put it to you in now, asking for just dare mayhap there's a movie in all of that. Or then again, maybe not, but still worthy asking to find out than not try at all. And as well as Zaggle Zooogle Zankeedoodle Part 1 abridged, a somewhat shorter, perhaps more page-turning pulpy popular version is available, known as Zaggle Zooogle Zankeedoodle Part 1, very short version, being released for those of you who perhaps prefer more pace, plot, and action, rather than excessive thematic economic argument that admittedly may be too much for some tastes in being about economics. As it is, thus being mindful about such, have tried to cater for these concerns for winning a wider audience if there ever could be in an unfilmed screenplay starring bankers, politicians, myriad media, and of course, economists, chancing to be coming after already wrapped about, so now may be filmed or at least worth endeavoring if ever could be. But right now, after years of umpteenth revising to now finishing the first part of this multi-part saga starring 08 events over a decade ago, for dare chancing made filmable for discussing what Guvo best econo do amid Kino, Hayek, and Milto econo agro heading fronting their sizable economic schools of thought core, publica politica econo choices on offer, but now confronted as of late March 2020 today in yet another extraordinary event. Alas, near risking almost worsening than what happened in 08. However, upon this time, not of their making nor prediction from winter 2019 thanks to COVID-19. Ensuing Guvo's worldwide emergency ordering, shutting indeed, locking down travel trade business and goods and services, allying instigating social isolation among citizens, helped in closing schools, sports, and other institutions to reduce viral spread. Pursuing such measures, Guvos are attempting preserving life, as well as everyday econo livelihoods, up unto getting us through this crisis and then back in business, hopefully in few months' time. For alas, after surviving pure-driven risking, seen as self-indulgent, 08 financial subprime crisis, to now witness virus-causing financial economic crisis, risking to resuming us revisiting Great Recession remade Mark II, but this time by COVID-19 culpability, blaming no bungling banker, nor central banker, nor lack of regulation or not, nor blaming any political financial hack or vying econ having nothing to do nor cooked up any virus despite some completely crackers conspiracy theories. You know, for fair enough, COVID-19 wasn't their fault, nor what I've read about. And yet now dare ask what they would advise Guvos do. Ergo market Kino would faster woo Guvo deficit spendo covering business wage stroke main costs, whilst freer market Milto Hayek prefer indeed concede Guvo easy terms, lend to business before, if needs be going any further toward Kino interceding agenda. All in pursuing measures to preserve stroke ride out, enabling business resumption after virus wanes for whatever the econo hue enlarging Guvo during viral crisis hue and cry evermore everybody, clamoring to be kept safe enabling Guvo enlarge answering everyday fears. But surely an ought put into greater context is way well below during planned up World War time heights, trading bombs bullets, whatever, while at least here on peacetime, after sharp drop in output, economic shutdown, causing mega jobless. But hopefully we should sharply bounce back up when soon resuming free trading normality as soon as possible. For assuming as we all do, we'll get through it. And myself personally, after finishing writing Exploring Economics starring 08 events for hoping engage wider discourse about what happened over the choices on offer. But now such fracas maybe is now eclipsed near risking outdated thanks to COVID-19. Mega eventing anew, no doubt surpassing old-fashioning Zaggle Zooogle 08 subprime events, near enough from well over decade on now, seen as somewhat perhaps passé having not written about any jumped-up virus. For alas, events alike history is one darn thing after another. In Reco, risking right now supplanting economists with epidemiologists, virologists, and here on author, hoping alike everyone that their hard-won proper science can vaccine win us through this crisis as soon as possible, thus resuming us to finer enjoy squabbling betwixt market v freer market economics. For surely after screenplay penning for perchance filming fabulo faming starring centro banking bungling banking Guvo gizmos, politica fandangos financial media and newspaper web to broadcasters and angry protesters, And above all, superstarring vying economists, storyline exploring competing econo theory, Austro-business cycle, monetarism, adaptive and expectation theory, rational expectation theory, efficient market theory, paradox of thrift, Phillips curve, blah blah. Arguing, exploring inflation v deflation, spending v saving, cost of money, the role of rates, central banking v decentralized banking, fiat v market-rated money, regulation v deregulation, big O Guvo, liberty and freedom v how much given to Guvo, too much planning v not enough, intervention v less so, blah blah atop other choices on offer. In that super, surely '08 was still far more interesting, complex, involving, challenging than any here today gone tomorrow. Silly Willy jumped up microbe, impelling Guvos worldwide, shutting down business of no fault of theirs in trying reduce viral spread, but of course reduces wealth, creating economic activity, which Guvos will cover in more borrowing. To tide us through what may be, albeit unlikely, being the worst peacetime crisis in a century bar Great Depression or Great Recession. And alas, deficit spending may be worthy if we avoid revisiting Great Depression or Great Recession in having less choice this time, or maybe a far less of an argument can be made, unlike storying '08 banking stroke, pure-driven econo agro being easier to explore greater dichotomy bewixed vying econo advice, starring Kino, Hayek, and Milto. But regarding today, for no doubt what deficit spent now awaits paid back in austerity-riven years ahead. In UK alike, other Guvos having to restore public finances, once again not from '08 banker bungling, but thanks to COVID-19. All of a sudden causing worldwide econo crisis, but still hopefully quicker restartable, recoverable than the '08 more complexico dragged-out financial banking calamity, I guess. And pray at least blame not Keynes for hatching COVID-19 to enlargen Guvo in his interventionist agenda, but events as this alike. '08 enjoy him justifying Guvo planned up a do that after crisis wanes is never fully disempowered to be given fully back from what taken from a mass. Ergo, as Hayek feared in writing The Road to Serfdom, which wartime Guvos ignored, when peacetime post-war Western status planned up cradle to grave a mass in welfare and higher taxation rules and regulation. But as from late March 2020, I shall leave the unfurling future to no doubt witness what happens, being already way beyond what hit us decade ago, that I best fitfully stick to having not writ about this virus-riven crisis. Undoubtedly having caused much economic damage, already no doubt impactico reducing worldwide GDP via Guvos, shutting down their economies against viral spread. And yet, if it prevails months ahead, Guvos will have no choice but allow business back up, then ill afford pay, verily enforcing them remaining ruinously idle. And although myself and minority others may not entirely agree with majority Guvos' costly self-inflicting lockdown for tackling the crisis, but alike everyone else, I'm self-isolating goodly abiding for now. Headlong herded in compliant generosity to conceding deficit spending if majority agreed during crisis clamors. Impelling Guvo planned up empowered to protect a mass, and yet what we all concede maybe needs must yet never fully given back or acknowledged via evermore those wishing enlarging their Guvo agenda for. Even now, rethinking capitalism in entirety that I myself, among others, never actually signed up for. For during hue and cry crisis, clamors verily such as times as this tending lending well toward Keynesian agenda, at the expense of Austro's Chicago free market, losing out alike, libertarian much else often evermore seeming distant dreaming to soon forget even that. And yet, having Guvos felt a due to answer trying to protect a mass fears via Guvo being well-intended, majority felt humane, preserving what we have to bounce back quickly after costly tided over to do so from sharp downward to soaring back up that should happen. Being at least our reward from our self-inflicted deficit spending, unlike Sweden deciding to not costly shut down. And aside right now, for if you are watching this in months or years ahead, then thankfully I have at least managed to somehow publish the first part of the Zaggle Zooogle series, thus getting myself alike all else through the other side of this wretched crisis. So until then, up unto upon right now for all those watching this. So obviously we have got through this now made diminishing becoming history. left for no doubt other people to write about, moreover, no doubt make a pandemic film about it. But for me, I'm still sticking with my good old-fashioned, pure-driven financial crisis econo sci-fi movie. You know, for at least it's got robots in.